New Orleans, like a lot of other cities, is a city of neighborhoods. It's built on the neighborhoods. And when you look into each of the neighborhoods that makes New Orleans so rich, some neighborhoods are more well-to-do than others. But what we appear to have going on in the city is that there are groups, or you can call them gangs, of individuals who grow up in the neighborhood. Mostly in the African-American communities in New Orleans. Not a lot of education. Groups start identifying with their neighborhoods or their housing developments they grow up in. And they form an alliance with one another to sell drugs and to commit crimes in their neighborhood. And when I say a neighborhood, I mean a 4x4 block area. And they stay in those neighborhoods and they don't really leave a whole lot. And for some reason, out of disrespect or drug turf or whatever it may be, they start fighting with basically the same type of kids who are 4 or 5 blocks away from them and who own, or at least think they own, those 4 or 5 blocks of the city. And so every neighborhood sometimes you can count, may have 2 or 3 gangs in it. I'll call them gangs, I don't know what else to call them, but we don't have gangs like the Crips and Bloods. But it's really just a neighborhood group of kids who grew up together or for some reason have an ownership in that neighborhood. But what starts happening is these gangs, while they're they start destroying the neighborhood by selling poison to the other people in the neighborhood in the form of crack cocaine, powder cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, whatever it may be. And out of disrespect or out of the greed for money, they start shooting each other. And they are heavily armed. And they don't care who they shoot. And I don't say that as a prosecutor just looking from afar. I say that as a prosecutor who actually talks to every one of the defendants that I prosecute, face to face with them in the room with their attorneys for hours. It is amazing to me that these young men have no regard at all for human life. So while the whole process here in the network is to try to use as little jail time as we can, there are all those individuals in our society that we have to remove from society for a long period of time. If we do not remove them from society, the neighborhood will not grow and the city will be destroyed. And that's basically what it comes down to. So what do we start doing to start looking at these crimes? As an assistant district attorney in New Orleans, we had more crime than we could imagine. We processed the cases that came through the police department. And this was basically every police report that came through the police department. On a single day, a single defendant committed a single crime, and it was witnessed by a single witness, and that's the case. And that case goes to trial, whether that be a murder, a rape, a robbery, drug distribution, whatever it may be. So the judges who are hearing these cases, and most of them end in pleas, some of them go to trial, they see what one defendant does on one day. Well, that's not really how crime takes place. If you look at it and take a couple steps back, crime takes place usually in these neighborhoods as part of a gang or gang activity. A group of individuals commit multiple crimes over a long period of time. Now, in fairness to the judges, as the prosecutor, I would get mad at the judge if I brought to him somebody who was in possession of cocaine or distribution of cocaine or an armed robbery, whatever it may be, and the judge said, look, this guy's a first-time offense. I'm going to give him, a year in jail, 6 months probation, whatever it may be. And as the prosecutor or the police officer, we know that guy was involved in so much more than just that one incident. And so what we started to do, and it's really taken off a lot since Katrina when we formed this multi-agency gang unit, the New Orleans Police Department has done so. And it's made up of NOPD officers, FBI, DEA. We actually housed that at the ATF office, the Homeland Security assigned to it. Alex Calenda, who's an assistant district attorney, is assigned to it. I'm assigned to it. We start looking at neighborhoods. Where is that crime taking place? And then who are the individuals in that neighborhood? Who's the members of that gang? It's pretty easy to identify, for the most part, who the gang members are. The local police officers in that district know who their problem children are. They arrest them every other day. Right? They arrest them on a possession of marijuana charge, a possession of cocaine charge, stealing a bicycle, all the smaller crimes. And they know that those guys are part of a group or a gang. So what we do is we form these alliances or these partnerships so we can go back and talk to the police and we can identify our target group. And once I target my first 10 guys in this gang, we start looking at how we can show that they are associates of one another. That could be from anything from Facebook or their prior arrest records together. They grew up in the same neighborhood, friendships. However, we can show that they are, in fact, associates of one another. We also go pull all of their prior arrests, every prior arrest they've ever had. Now, I did a gang back in 2006, 10 defendants. I pulled all of their rap sheets. These guys have been arrested over 50 times in like a 3-year period. All of them combined. And you know what? When you start looking at all of their arrests and where all their arrests were from, it was all within about a 2-block area. All of their arrests were for possession of cocaine. All of those police reports on a dot, make a dot on the map where all those things took place. And you'll start seeing a story. Right? You start reading all those police reports in chronological order. But your story is going to have some missing chapters to it, obviously, because people who commit crime don't always get caught. As good as law enforcement is, we catch you about maybe 10% of the time that you commit the crime. So while all of those police reports represent a pretty significant impact of the city, crimes that took place in the city, what I told the detectives and the agents I work with is I want to prosecute these guys for all the crimes they've committed in the last 5 years and where they didn't get caught. So how can we do that? The police didn't catch them, they're good to go. Well, let's go find out who would be the witnesses to these crimes. Who are the people who are suffering from the distribution of narcotics? So we go back and we can use our computers and we can look up all the drug addicts who were arrested in that neighborhood over the same time frame. We can go find out who all the prostitutes were in that neighborhood, all the burglars, all the guys who were picked up on theft charges. More likely than not, those guys, all of those people have drug problems. Well, anybody who's got a drug problem has to have a source of supply. And when you go start interviewing all of those individuals, you're going to get a couple people who show you the bird, and I'm not talking to you, but you're going to get a lot of people who want to come in and cooperate. Because those are the people at the bottom of the totem pole. They're the ones who are ingesting these poisons, the ones whose lives are ruined, whether it's through prostitution or through being a drug addict or alcoholic, whatever it may be. And we can, as law enforcement, get them some type of treatment. And they can come in and they can tell the truth as to who they've been buying that drugs from for the last 5 years. And so you find a handful of those witnesses and you give them the security that what they tell you is going to be secret by bringing them into the federal grand jury or to the state grand jury. And you start getting a narrative of their life. Now, every day of their life for the last 5 years, they lived on those same street corners of this gang. And that this gang fueled their habits by providing them with crack cocaine, heroin, marijuana, whatever it may be. The quantities of drugs that go through those neighborhoods are going to astound you. While none of your defendants may have been arrested by the police with anything more than 3 or 4 or 5 rocks of cocaine or a quarter ounce of heroin, when you start hearing the testimony of the amount of drugs that those drug addicts, those prostitutes, and the downtrodden have consumed from that drug gang over a 5-year period, it goes into kilograms and kilograms of drugs that are ruining that neighborhood. We also go back and look at the shootings that have taken place in that neighborhood and try to find the motives for those shootings. One of the big things that we've been looking at is ATF has a NIBIN system. If you haven't had the NIBIN system in your community, you really ought to reach out to the ATF SAC, Special Agent in Charge, and try to see if the Department of Justice can fund a NIBIN machine. It is a ballistics computer. And every crime, shooting crime in the city of New Orleans, it's put into this computer, every casing from every murder, every attempted murder, every discharge. And that computer will start kicking out what crimes are connected by guns. And you will see, at least we do in New Orleans, that a lot of our gang members keep their guns for a while and trade them back and forth with their fellow gang members. It tells a very, very powerful story in court. When you take all of those things together, the use of the grand jury, the NIBIN technology, the crime mapping, you can paint a pretty good picture of a criminal organization that is destroying a city. And what you do with that organization is you can come back either under federal law, under state, most state laws have the same thing. You can charge them either with RICO, racketeering activity, or with conspiracy laws. They carry mandatory minimum sentences, which is a very hot topic around the country right now. But when some of those gang members are indicted and they brought to federal court, and the judge asked the assistant U.S. attorney to turn to the defendants and read the penalties they are facing, and we tell them they're facing 20 years, mandatory minimum 10 years or 20 years in life, or possibly a mandatory life sentence. Those defendants who have been in and out of the criminal justice system and who have never served basically any time in the state system, now facing a 20-year or mandatory life sentence in federal court. Most of them lean over to me and say, Mr. Landrieu, I think I really need to come talk to you. And that's really what the key to this is. Because we can't operate without cooperation. Cooperation from the community or cooperation from the gang members. We wouldn't have this problem to some extent if the community from the very beginning came forward and provided this information to law enforcement. But they don't for a number of different reasons. But once we get the defendants in court and they come in and they start providing us detailed information as to the inner workings of their organization and start solving homicides, it makes a huge impact. Every one of these cases that we have done, and I think now we might be up to 10 indictments out, I'm not sure, in the last 3 years between the state and federal government, everyone has been a huge success. It lets the judges know, not that this person committed one crime on one day, but shows the judge the full range of the violations that this young man has committed against his community, and allows for an appropriate sentence at the end of the day if the person comes in and cooperates with us, and if he does not want to come and cooperate, well, he doesn't have to take responsibility the hard way. I don't think we've lost any one of these cases, or even a defendant in one of these cases. We have dropped the count here and there, but for the most part, they've come down pretty hard. And what it does for the community, when you go and you grab the 15 worst guys and take them all out at once, you really almost feel the community start to breathe again. You see the neighborhood come back to life a little bit, and you see the city get a little bit better. So we have done that using those philosophies, and it has been a big success. Just last week we returned a 42-count RICO murder indictment with 12 defendants, charging them with they're involved in over 12 murders and about 4 or 5 other non-fatal shootings in a 2-year period. That was one deadly gang. Think about the number of dead bodies they have connected to them. So that's one of the things we've been doing in the city of New Orleans, and it has been I can't say it's going to solve the problem, but it's certainly helping us get us moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Maurice. There, just before I introduce Alex, there's a couple of seats sort of scattered. If somebody wants to, if you guys want to move up, there's 2 here, and if anybody that's
Several over here.
Several. So now let me introduce Alexander Calenda, who works on the project that Maurice just described. Alex is from the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office, prosecutor. He's the supervising attorney for this this task force called the Multi-Agency Gang, or MAG, unit, which is this great collaboration between federal, state, and local law enforcement, specifically targeted on the most violent gang members in New Orleans. And it's my pleasure to introduce Alex.
Thanks, Chauncey. Before I begin, I would like to echo a sentiment that you're going to hear throughout, I think, the rest of this panel. This is the guru right here, Maurice Landrieu. I can tell you that everything that we have done in New Orleans has, in these racketeering cases, these conspiracy cases, myself, my office has leaned on Maurice because it was uncharted territory, especially on the state level. We began investigating what appeared to be an isolated murder on May 29, 2012, in which at 5:45 in the afternoon, a 10-year-old birthday party was going on in the middle of Central City in New Orleans. 3 gunmen run up on the birthday party with probably about 40 to 50 people outside, and just as Maurice had said, there is no regard for human life right now on the streets, at least in the city of New Orleans. These guys turned an AK-47, 40 caliber, and 9mm on that birthday party, began to spray indiscriminately. They killed an innocent woman who was driving 3 blocks away, who took a round from an AK-47 to her head. They hit 5 of the gang members that were the intended targets. All of the intended targets, of course, did not see anything. And most tragically, they hit a 5-year-old little girl through and through the stomach with an AK-47 round. And there's an iconic picture that came across the Times-Picayune main newspaper in New Orleans. And it's of her father holding her as she bled to death on the front steps of their house. And I tell you that story because, in truth, we were identifying gangs in New Orleans at the time, but we hadn't really confronted the problem. Maurice was rocking and rolling in the federal system, but we heard a lot about, only the feds can do it. Only the feds can do these conspiracy cases. I look in the audience right now and I see former Chief Ronald Surpass here, who was the superintendent of police in New Orleans at the time. And I had it from my own office. I had it from a lot of people in NOPD. You guys can't do this on a state level. Once we identified that this was gang warfare and these gangs existed, and they would go to such extreme measures that they would get their targets, that they would run up on birthday parties and just start spraying, something had to be done. And we realized that the old model wasn't working, and all we had to do was look a mile down the street to see what the federal government was doing to realize we can do this. So in September of 2012, with Chief Surpass's blessing, the mayor putting pressure on law enforcement to find a solution, and the district attorney's blessing, I opened a federal-style grand jury investigation. And as Maurice put it, you have to just locate people with knowledge and you force them into that grand jury, one way or the other. If they are not going to be cooperative, you explain laws of perjury, you explain contempt of court if they fail to answer questions. And we had grand jury subpoenas flying. Eventually, we heard, well, you can indict a case, but you can't prosecute it in state court. You can't get it through a state system. We handed down a 15 defendant, 51 count indictment that had 15 murders among the acts. And then I heard it at arraignment. I heard it from the defense bar. I heard it from people in my office. You guys can't do this in the state level. You can't get cooperation like the feds do. I can tell you that changed. Because what you have to do when you do these cases, I think Maurice will agree with this, you have to know everything about your targets. And that's what we did. We learned everything. So when you sit down with these guys, you're able to tell them their criminal history, what they had for dinner 2 days ago, and who their other girlfriend is. You get in their heads. And we got that cooperation. And in the first case, it was called the 110ers. As of right now, we have 14 of the 15 defendants have pled or been convicted at trial and received life sentences. So, in every jurisdiction, you may think, well, the federal government can do it. I don't know if we can do it. I can tell you, if you have the right team and the right focus, I believe that any jurisdiction can do a case like this. And you have to have the support of, everybody involved. Because once everyone has to come to the table, the FBI, the ATF, state, federal prosecutors, everybody. And when you do that, I truly believe that these cases can be done. And, I think New Orleans is a testament to that. Currently, we now have 4 including the 110ers, 4 racketeering cases pending in criminal district court. 3 of the 4 are almost reached their conclusion. They range from 2 6-defendant cases, the 110ers, which was 15 defendants, and then we have 1 other that's pending in court now, where we still have a little ways to go. And I'll finish with this. One of the things that Maurice and I started talking about back in 2012 was the state-federal relationships and the information sharing that had to go on. And that father that sat there and held and cradled his 5-year-old daughter, at the same time, was also a target of U.S. Attorney's Office. And within, I believe, a 6-month span, we indict the 110ers, and they come back, federal government indicts the Allen family. And the information sharing and the flow, just going back and forth, was impressive. And I think that's what you strive for when you're talking about cooperation at the state and federal level.
Thank you, Alex. Our next speaker is Tate Chambers from the United States Attorney's Office in the Central District of Illinois. You all have his biography, but just a couple of things to highlight. He's the lead task force attorney for the OCDEF program in the office. He also spent time in Washington and was the national coordinator for the Project Safe Neighborhood program, and in addition received an award from the Department of Justice for his work in reentry, crime prevention, and community engagement. As you see from the rest of his bio, he's basically seen the criminal justice system, I think, from every perspective a prosecutor could see it. So, Tate Chambers.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I assume that most of you know focus deterrence, so I'm going to use terms, and then if you don't know them, we can talk afterwards. But I assume most of you understand focus deterrence and what the terms are. When I was out in D.C. Working at EOUSA, they said go out and find the most successful anti-violence strategies. That took me to Maurice. And I studied the New Orleans strategy. We brought them up there and we went down there, and it works. It stops violence. I also went down and met with Marty down in High Point, Rob Lang and the folks down in High Point, and I studied High Point, and I learned about focus deterrence, and it works. So when we got back to Peoria, we decided, let's take the two and put them together and see what happens. We run two types of focus deterrence programs in Peoria. We run a most violent offender, and this isn't used but that. And then we run the one called Group Violence Reduction Strategy. And that is basically, for those of you who don't know, we identify all the crews in Peoria, bring in representatives from each of those, in our case 12 crews, and warn them. We warn them. We say, look, we've identified you and your crew as one of the most violent in Peoria. If you pick up a gun, if you shoot the first body that falls, we're coming after you and we're going to prosecute you. And then we give them another message. But if you put down the gun, we have a helping hand here. We use a dirty word, and I hope I don't offend anybody out there, but I'm going to use a 4-letter word, and it's just necessary. We use the word love, L-O-V-E. We say we love you. We love you. The chief says, I love you. The mayor says, I love you. The U.S. attorney says, I love you. And then we give them a message of hope. Put down the gun. Let's turn things around together because we need you in this community. Well, always somebody doesn't put down the gun, right? First for us it was Bomb Squad, and then for us it was Zone 4. So the issue was, we know what the state and locals do when they don't put down the gun. They do a massive enforcement operation. They rock their world. Well, what do the feds do? It takes me a year to get to a RICO. I can't get to a RICO like that. Well, if you take the New Orleans strategy and you basically go back in all the paperwork, pull all the reports, put everybody in the grand jury, you can get to a drug conspiracy and a 924-0, for those of you that don't know, a conspiracy to use a gun in furtherance of a drug conspiracy. You can get to one of those. We've done it in 90 days and 65 days, and our goal for the next one is 40 days. Because David tells you that the consequence for turning down the offer of hope has to be swift, it has to be certain, and it has to be severe. Okay, swift is not a year later. Swift, 45 days will do it. So we've done it twice. Two different crews have turned down the offer, bodies have fell. We go out and we put together these cases, we indict them, 14 in one, and actually 14 in the second one too. Bring them into federal court. But there's where we differ a little bit from the strategy used in New Orleans, because we're sick of severe. It's not working for us. We're tired of it. If I was working a most violent offender group like they are, then I'd be concerned about severe. But I just looked somebody in the eye a few months ago and told him I loved him and that he was an important part of my community. And I needed him back in my community to make it work. And now I want to send him away for 20 years? What kind of sense does that make? That doesn't make any sense. So what we do is this instead. Because we are tired of severe, we tried to average for most of the gang members that we pick up using this strategy, a 5-year sentence. Here's what a 5-year sentence does. Go to the Bureau of Prisons, they go to low or medium-low facility. There they have education, they have training, they have drug rehab, they have all the services available to them. Then they'll come back to us. And when they come back to us, we ask the judge for an extra long length of supervised release. And as a condition of that supervised release, to participate in our reentry program. Because if we needed them on the street 6 months ago, and we loved them 6 months ago, we still need them on the street today. Because in many cases, these gang members are the leaders in their community. And we do need them back out of prison after some time to let things cool off. We need them back out of prison and back in our communities being productive and working with us, not against us. So what we do is what we arrest and we detain. When we do our initial arrest, we do the New Orleans strategy. We arrest, we detain, the violence stops right then. Why? Because most of the violence are the crews shooting back and forth, right? Retaliation? Is that what the studies show us? Retaliation? If you take one of the crews and put them in the county jail, there's no retaliation. So the violence stops right there. And then for most of them, I mean, for the most violent, we'll seek sentences of 10 or 15. But for most of them, we seek a sentence of 5 years, which is what, about 3.5? That's enough time that they've served a year pretrial in jail. They got about 2.5 left to go. They go, they come back, they're no longer part of the scene. The scene has cooled down substantially, at least with respect to them, and they can work better in the reentry program. So that's the way we do it. It's been successful for us. Mike, violence is down in Peoria.
Murder's down 66%, cheats are down over 70%.
It's working. It's working, and we're not warehousing people that we need in our community for 15, 20, 25, 30 years. I'm totally behind the most violent guys, the guys that just never learn to protect the public from them. But for most of these guys, remember, group violence reduction is vicarious liability. You didn't have to do anything. The fact you're a member of the group and you've done things in the past is the way I prosecute you for group violence reduction. For vicarious liability, 5 is enough.
Thank you, Tate. Our next speaker is Lauren Baraldi, who is a veteran prosecutor from the Philadelphia DA's office. She is the chief of the Gun Violence Task Force and the project coordinator for focused deterrence in the Philly DA's office. Lauren.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. The Philly DA's office and our local police department a couple of years ago sat down together and thought focused deterrence would be a great idea. But we didn't have kind of the administration over everyone dictating it from above. It was more of a grassroots effort. So when we sat down and talked about what our levers were going to be, you know, not that we don't love the feds, but we didn't have federal partners. It was just us. And our local court system is not a very strong arm. So we sat down, brainstormed, and came up with what we call our non-traditional levers, which David mentioned this morning. So we entered into a partnership with our local electric company, and they trained our police officers who are on our gang task force and to spot people who were stealing electricity. And we called Comcast, who's based in Philadelphia, and spoke to them about people who were stealing cable. We also entered into a relationship with the Child Support Enforcement Unit, and when we pull levers, we also go down those lists of anybody who owes child support. We also have a close relationship with our probation department, which we did not in the beginning. That was a tough, heavy lift for us. But when a shooting occurs, anyone who is on the list from that group within 24 hours goes in and has to give a urine. And they also then get stepped up probation, whereby they have to come back weekly. They also get home visits. So that's been the non-traditional levers we've done, with the idea of what's swift and certain punishment. That when the DA speaks to them and says, you know, if there's going to be an action, there's going to be an equal and opposite reaction. And we wanted that reaction to be within 24 to 48 hours. Now, we still do we ask for high bail, we still ask for the longer sentences, but for us, we wanted to get, it's not very PC to say it, but the most bang for our buck within the shortest period of time. And we have made tough decisions. You know, it's the night before Thanksgiving, and there was a shooting on that Tuesday, and it's that Wednesday night, and there's somebody on the phone, police officer on the phone, saying we have 3 houses that we're going to turn electricity off, and it's cold in November in Philadelphia. You know, it is. It's not, I mean, but that's a tough call to make, because there's a mom, a grandmom, and a bunch of children in that house, but, you know, the lights were turned off. And the shooter's not in the house, but the lights were still turned off. Now, we have not prosecuted anyone for theft of services, and that was the policy decision that was made, as far as we're not going to prosecute the grandmom, you know, for these misdemeanor charges for PECO, our electric company, or for Comcast or anything else. But that's how Philadelphia has handled, kind of not the hammer more to it. It's more of a death by 1,000 cuts is more of how we handle our enforcement action, and we've seen success in the past couple of years of how we've handled it.
Thank you, Lauren. And our last speaker is Susan Herman, who is the Deputy Commissioner of Collaborative Policing at the NYPD. And again, you have her bio, but has had illustrious career and at all sorts of different levels. Among other things, she's been a special advisor, special counsel to 3 different NYPD police commissioners. She's a national leader in crime victims' rights, and wrote a book, the book Parallel Justice for Victims of Crime. She's also professor at Pace, NYU Law School, NYU School of Public Policy, and a great partner to all of us here in New York City. Susan.
Thank you, Chauncey. When you're old enough, your resume is really long, right? Let me just say that how many people in this room are involved in focused deterrence work in one form or another? Raise your hand. Currently involved in it. So most of you know what the terms are. You know what the essential elements are. And I'm just going to tell you, we're at the beginning stages of our group violence intervention work in New York City. We originally identified about 80 groups that we thought we'd be working with in a portion of Brooklyn, not even all of Brooklyn, a patrol borough of Brooklyn North and 2 precincts in Brooklyn South. And now, several months later, we think that there are about 100 groups that we're working with. We've had 2 call-ins so far, numerous custom notifications, and what we call no retaliation letters have been delivered to people. So after a shooting, we go to someone's home and we give them a special letter and a talking to about the importance of not retaliating. So we believe in this short period of time, which is about 6 months, that we've communicated directly with about half of the groups that we're talking about that exist in our catchment areas. We have no doubt that the word is spreading from group to group, that representatives of these groups have brought the message back to other people in their groups. We have no doubt that the 3 messages, that the violence must stop, that social services, help, assistance is available if you want it, and that there will be real consequences if the violence continues, those messages are getting out there. We have preliminary results so far. Nobody's talking very definitively yet. What I can tell you is that homicides are slightly up in the city of New York, but they are up less in our catchment area, and shootings are down in our catchment area more than they are in any other part of the city. But this changes week by week, so I even hesitate to say that this is a conclusion at this point. It's an early result that we're talking about. I've been asked to not focus on our New York City ceasefire enforcement action today because you know what the elements are. You all are doing it. I've been asked to tell you something different, and that is how these elements, these characteristics of the work, the direct communication, the clarity about what the rules are, the sense that there will be consequences if whatever the problematic behavior is continues, how that way of working is starting to permeate the way the police department is acting in other ways besides with New York City ceasefire. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of how some of those elements are kind of infiltrating other work that we've been doing. The first example that I want to tell you about has to do with marijuana enforcement. Several months ago, we changed the department's marijuana enforcement policy such that people who were caught with small amounts of marijuana on them would no longer be arrested on the misdemeanor, which it still is in New York State, but they would be given a summons on the lesser included violation. And at the same time, people caught smoking marijuana in public would be arrested on that misdemeanor. So I see lots of eyebrows already going up, and you can imagine that there's a little bit of confusion about what this policy is. What does that mean? I can have it, I'll get a summons, but if I smoke, I'm going to get arrested. Saturday Night Live even did a wonderful skit about it because it raises lots of questions, right? So we also, with our ear to the ground, started realizing that with changes going on around the country around marijuana laws, that with this change and the confusion that resulted, that people were starting to think that marijuana was legal in New York City, and it's not. So in the spirit of communicating with people who are likely to commit the offense that you're talking about, being clear about what the rules are, and offering assistance, we created this information card in English and in Spanish. And the front of it basically tells you you can't smoke, right? It's still, marijuana is illegal in New York City. And the back of it lays out exactly what the law is, exactly what the consequences will be. And in the lower right-hand corner, and something unusual for a police department publication, is our offer of assistance. If you are concerned you have a substance use problem or need a referral for treatment, speak to your doctor or health professional, or call 1-800-LIFE-NET, free confidential helpline for New York City residents. This has gone out to 50,000 people in the city of New York, but it's being distributed not by the police mostly, we are distributing it a little bit, but it's being distributed by the Department of Youth and Community Development in recreation centers around the city. It's being distributed by the Department of Health. What I love is that in some of the places where they distribute free condoms. And soon, my hope is, it will be distributed by NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority. So we're trying to get the word out. So you're starting to see it's a little bit similar, right? It's got some of the elements. The second example I'm going to give you has to do with copper wire theft, right? I hear somebody laughing about copper wire theft. Okay, so copper wire in the subways is about this big around, and it's very, very heavy. And when it is stolen, as you might imagine, you can get a pretty good price for that amount of copper, even though it is stamped that it's from the MTA, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, and therefore anyone who buys it knows they're buying stolen property. So you're not allowed to buy this stolen copper wire. We have wire stolen, had wire stolen on a regular basis. This sounds harmless, but it not only causes train delays that can be significant, it causes fires in the tunnels of the subways, and it's actually very dangerous. So we got tired of arresting the same people over and over again. They'd go in, they'd come out, they'd steal more, sell more, get arrested, steal more, get arrested, go in, come out, keep going. We got tired of this and decided that let's take some of this work and apply it to that. And we went to the people who were buying the copper wire, and that's scrapyards in the city of New York. And after we sold them some copper wire several times, right, undercover, selling them copper wire, we nuisance abated 2 or 3 of them. And what that means is we closed them because of the amount of arrests that were made at the scrapyards. We took them to court. They were fined considerable amounts of money. And they were closed until they could reopen with certain conditions that we mutually agreed upon. So we haven't had copper wire theft in months and months and months until recently. Any New Yorkers here might have seen the headlines. 500 feet of copper wire were stolen from the subways relatively recently. And we thought, okay, all right, same with GVI, same with focused deterrence in drug markets. You can't just, say we're going to do it once and it's all over. You have to keep going. So we're getting ready to go back out to the scrap yards. But before we could do that, and this is where I want you to think GVI, group violence, and peer pressure, and taking the group dynamic and using it positively. Before we could take action, this email is sent by one scrapyard person to 8 other scrapyard owners in the city. Please note that MTA lost 500 feet of wire this morning. If anyone goes to your yard with no ID or MTA wire, we cannot buy it at all. This is the news for our employee, Robert. Please take a look at the above link and be careful when you buy material. That went to 8. That's as good as one group member sending the message to everybody else and policing themselves. We don't have to do anything. There hasn't been another theft. There hasn't been, the guy who stole that wire has been arrested, but that's it. It's calmed down because of this. This happens when you communicate directly, you tell people what the rules are, and you ask them to work with you to stop others from committing the same offense. And now I'll tell you what David really wanted me to talk about, which is our work with costume characters in Times Square. This is his favorite adaptation of the pulling levers work and the direct communication work. So if you've been to Times Square at all, you've seen lots of vendors, you've seen lots of street performers, but you've also seen scores of costume characters. These are Disney characters, right? Elmo, Spider-Man, Minnie Mouse, I don't even know what else, but they're all out there, right? And what's wrong with that, you ask? There's nothing wrong with that as long as they are not overly aggressive in how they pose for pictures with tourists. They're allowed to ask for a tip. They're not allowed to ask a certain fee. If someone doesn't want to pay them at all, they're not allowed to surround them, intimidate them, chase them down the street, grab them, all kinds of things that were going on. The worst, in my view, is, can I give you my baby so that I can take a picture of you with my baby, and then you don't give me back the baby until I give you the amount of money that you want? That's bad, right? So there have been a number of arrests of these costume characters. I'm the sort of levity on the panel, right? So there have been a number of arrests of these costume characters, and it's problematic. It means somebody comes to Times Square, they may or may not speak English well, they have an experience like that with their child, they're not coming back to Times Square, and they don't know why this was supposed to be a happy experience, right? This is not good. And we're making lots of arrests in Times Square, and we decide, okay, it's time to change this dynamic. It's time to reset the relationship with the costume characters. So one day we went up to the red steps in Times Square, and if you haven't seen them, please go see them so you know what I'm talking about. They're sometimes called the stairs to nowhere. It's red, sort of lucite, shiny, beautiful stairs that go up to nowhere, and it's just a place for people to sit by the TKTS places where you can buy discounted tickets. And we waited till most of the tourists were off the steps. We asked all the costume characters that were there to come join us on the steps, and we had a call-in on the red steps in Times Square. You see why David loves this, right? And he calls this fuzzy deterrence, right? So we met on the steps, and they're in full costume, and I'm in my costume, and we told them what the law was and what they were allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do. And it was clear within moments that there was great confusion on their part about what they were allowed to do and not. And I realize ignorance of the law is no excuse, but when you're talking to people who clearly don't know what the rules are, it changes the dynamic a little bit, and you start wanting to explain the rules. Well, they meet on a weekly basis with a an organizer of a group that organizes new immigrants. And they invited me, after that first call-in, they invited me to come to one of their weekly meetings. And so our second meeting was at their place, and there were about 55 costume characters there. And we had a translator, they had a translator, an interpreter, and it was clear in moments, there were 2 people in the room who were comfortable speaking English. And they asked question after question about exactly what they could do and what they couldn't do. And we were there for over an hour explaining the details of what they could do. And ultimately, we asked them whether they would like us to draft for them the do's and don'ts so that they could understand it and write it in English and write it in Spanish. And they said, absolutely, that would be great. Meanwhile, we had started leafleting in Times Square. We had people handing out, our auxiliary officers were handing out to tourists a postcard like this that said, photos with costume characters are free, tipping is optional. To change the dynamic so that tourists knew it doesn't matter if the costume character tells you it has to be 20 bucks, it's a tip. You pay what you want to pay. Tipping is optional. So that had happened in between the first and the second meeting, and they complained to us that they felt that we were targeting costume characters and that the rules were really the same for all street performers. The guy who sits on the sidewalk with his guitar and the case open, he or she plays for tips as well. You don't walk by and listen to a song and have someone say, that'll be 20 bucks, right? You put the amount of money that you want into the case. And so why were we just talking about costume characters? Why didn't we talk about all street performers? Well, they had a point there, okay? So between the second meeting and the third meeting, we modified our flyer. We listened to them. And the next flyer said, tipping street performers is optional, because that's the point. We didn't need to say that photos were free. These are people who earn their living by taking photos with people. We needed to say that tipping is optional, and we needed to talk about street performers. So we listened to them, we changed our message. We also created, in English and in Spanish, the do's and don'ts of what street performers can do in Times Square. And at our third meeting, in between the second and the third meeting, besides those 2 things that sound very responsive and wonderful, we also had a demonstration action. We took a decoy into Times Square, and we made 1 arrest for overly aggressive solicitation. So we had our third meeting. We gave out exactly what they had asked for. We showed that we had changed our flyer, that we were going to continue handing out that flyer, but it was a message they liked. And we said, yes, that was a decoy, and from now on, you're not going to know whether you're talking to a cop or you're talking to a tourist. So behave yourself. So we had a demonstration action. We had direct communication. We had people saying, please spread the message to other groups. What else does David say? It's fuzzy deterrence and it's costume notification, right? Okay? So I know, but he's not in the room, so I have to do it. So what's important, I think, about this story, besides the fact that we've had 1 arrest in the last 10 months in Times Square, that it's working, that we've developed a relationship with them. They gave us, literally, when we handed this out, we got a standing ovation. They loved this. We had 100 people at the last meeting, and they were grateful that the rules had been spelled out clearly. But I think the reason that I think David wanted me to talk about this was that it is true, we are very engaged in New York City ceasefire, and our hope and very real expectation is that we will see significant reductions of group violence in New York City. At the same time, though, we are taking many of the elements of the initiative, applying it to other enforcement actions, because direct communication, clear explanation of what you're doing and why you're doing it, opportunities for questions and genuine offers of assistance in other contexts also produces less crime, more procedural justice, and more positive police-community relations. And as small as all of these examples may sound, they add up. And I encourage you to take the principles of this work and apply it to all of your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. So now we'll open it up for questions. I would just sort of frame it in this way. I think one of the themes through really all of our speakers, which is really the essence of the network and David Kennedy's work, I think, is that crime is not inevitable, that there are rational choices that people make, whether an Elmo character in Times Square, they're a gang member in New Orleans, that with the right strategies and the right interventions, that actually we can affect the rational choices that people make through police and prosecution and community strategies. And that really is the essence of each of our speakers' work and the strategies they've been involved in. So any questions? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Carter Stewart. I'm with DOJ in Columbus, Ohio. And my question is for Maurice, Alex, and Tate. We're continually looking at our violence deterrence strategies as well. And there are two issues that keep popping up, and I'll put my two issues into the question. One is most of the murders in our district aren't gang members retaliating towards each other. They're, you look at my girl, or you came in my yard, or some sort of moment situation that is not forethought. And I'm wondering how your deterrence strategies impact those types of situations where it's an instantaneous anger to gun to shoot. And then the second question goes to the gangs. If you have 10 individuals, say 10 17-year-olds, they grew up together, they're a gang, maybe associates. 2 of them are hyper-violent, 3 of them are somewhat violent in terms of they get in fights, they have violent history, and then 5 of them have arrest records, loitering, vandalism, what have you, but they're not violent. How are your strategies taken into account when you're taking down a group like that, the difference in their backgrounds, especially when the 5 non-violent ones don't cooperate and aren't willing to take?
Can I start with the last question first? The way that it works with us is that we're very fortunate to have a judge who's totally on board with focused deterrence. And when we bring them a conspiracy case with those differing types of levels of culpability, he's really good at sorting it all out and assigning appropriate sentences based on that. They still have had the conspiracy to distribute the drugs and to carry the guns. They're still guilty of that. But he looks at background and he tries to work and make sure everything's really fair. We have had him just no sentence, just straight to the rehab. So we're blessed to have a good judge.
Let me answer. That's a very good question. So how do the smaller guys in the gang get treated? It's easy to treat them leniently when they come in and cooperate. The bigger question is, what happens if they don't cooperate? And I guess there's a lot of different views on this. But my view is this. If you are a member of a gang, and we arrest you because you are involved in the gang distribution of narcotics, or whatever your role may be, I don't think the United States should ever be embarrassed to make a citizen who has committed a crime against the nation, you charge you with a federal crime, that's basically what you've done, to stand up before God and country and say, I did it, and I'm sorry for what I did. But if you're not willing to cooperate with me, it seems to me that you still want to be part of the problem. We have to try to, and that's what one of the things I do when I speak to the defendants in person after we indict them, we bring up to the U.S. Attorney's Office with their attorney, and I try to get them to cooperate, because I think it isn't, unfortunately, it's the biggest problem that we have in the community, that nobody wants to cooperate with law enforcement. It's almost in your DNA sometimes when you grow up in a certain community. Whatever happens, you know, take your lick, go to trial, don't ever cooperate. But it seems if you think about an alcoholic or a drug addict, when they go to AA or their treatment program, the first thing they have to do is stand up and say, my name is Maurice Landrieu, and I'm an alcoholic. And I gotta stop hanging around the people I hang around with, because I hang around with these A, B, C, and D, and they're the ones who are giving me alcohol and feeding me alcohol. If I'm gonna be an alcoholic and say, yeah, I'm an alcoholic, but I'm not telling you who I hang around with, and I'm gonna go back and hang out with the same people I hung out with before, we're not really solving the problem. Those defendants have to come in and cooperate. If they don't want to cooperate, it's just a huge signal to me that they want to be part of the problem. They want to come in, they want to keep their head low, they want to go to jail, do that 2 or 3 years, get back out, and they're going to be doing the same exact thing that they've done before. Because if we're going to change people, while we all want to try to change people, we can't change anybody who doesn't want to change internally. So I think we have to, as law enforcement officers, as dads, as coaches, whatever we may be, to speak to those young men and say, you owe it to your community to stand up and tell the truth. If that guy was distributing narcotics, if that guy your friend pulled out a gun and shot somebody, you need to be the man to stand up in court and do it. We demand it of witnesses. If you're going to be a witness in a criminal courtroom, in any criminal courtroom, you have to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God. But we never demand it of the defendant. And I think that's wrong. We ought to demand it of every defendant that comes into court who's going to plead guilty and ask for mercy. I'll give you the chance to earn a second opportunity, but you got to earn it. I'm not going to give it to you. And it seems to me it's not too much to ask you to come in and tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Sir, from Peoria. My name is Charles Harvick. I'm from Illinois also. I work very closely with you guys down in Southern Illinois. And I just wanted to say your public schools, my nephew and nieces attend your public schools. Your programs that you have working up down there in downstate Illinois, amazing. Keep doing what you're doing. And love is the answer sometimes. New York, perfect model. We've been following your model for some years now, for a few years now, and it's a great model. Sir, down in New Orleans, you hang everybody. We don't hang everybody here up north. I was born in Louisiana, so I'm not from New Orleans. How many lawsuits do you get? How many charges are overturned? You're using what you call the derelicts of your community to testify against the derelicts. So who are you trusting?
Well,
you're using drug addicts, forcing them to tell on their buddies, right?
We're trying to find the truth. We're trying to find.
So what happens when you don't find the truth, and who's the truth? What's the truth?
Well, that's what juries are for. The juries decide what the truth is for. So this is my question, my answer to you. None of the cases that I've handled have been overturned.
To date, you usually take about 10 or 15 years.
Okay, well, I've been at it for over 20-something, so I'm so far so good. But one of the things, and it's a very good question you asked, is one of the grand jurors asked me the same question. He said, Mr. Landrieu, you keep bringing us prostitutes and drug addicts and what have you. Said, how are we supposed to believe them? And my answer to them was this. I can't give you that answer. You have to, when you talk to any person on the street, you have to judge a person's credibility, ask them questions, determine what they're telling you is the truth, listen to their life story, and whether that person is telling the truth or not. And as I continue to bring people from the neighborhood in to the grand jury to testify about what was going on in that neighborhood, I think the overwhelming majority of those grand jurors decided these people are in fact telling the truth, because it was corroborated by all of the arrests that were made in that neighborhood. It was corroborated by the ballistics charts that were in that neighborhood. It was corroborated by all the stories. And so when we think about drugs as being a victimless crime, one of the things that I think was a very learning experience for the grand jurors is that they saw a lot of these witnesses who were in fact victims of the drugs problem in the country, about people being hooked on crack cocaine or powder cocaine. If those people are addicted to crack cocaine, they're getting the drugs from somewhere. That's not it's not made up. It's not fiction. If we have the coroner's office being bombarded with young men who have 50 and 75 bullet holes in them, we have a murder problem. Nobody's making that up. Somebody is responsible for those crimes, and it's our job as law enforcement to go find out as best we can, and I promise you we're not perfect, as to who is committing those crimes. Or we can sit back and do nothing.
Well, we're not suggesting that you sit back and do nothing, but you made a statement earlier about if you arrest a guy for possession and then you go back in his history for 5 years and say, let's convict him on all of the things that we weren't able to prove earlier, but we're going to find witnesses, the users, the prostitutes. It sounds like Old South, sir, I'm sorry.
Well, the question is it the truth?
That's what we don't know, and evidently you don't know.
Well, but that's why we go to court, because we have a disagreement. And this is really one of the big...
Well, we all know that the district attorneys run the courtrooms, okay?
Well, that's
we know that in most of your charges, most of your cases, were not trial by jury. They were mostly trial by cop-outs, because people feel like you have their back up against the wall. And I'm truly not here to fight with you, sir, but I just feel like something should be said about what you said about how you're delivering criminal justice.
We all have our opinions on how it works.
Thank you, sir.
All right, we're going to shift gears to, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm a prosecutor in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm at the state level. And so we're deeply engaged in the attorney's effort as well. My question has to do with how do you handle issues of swiftness? So I know you talked about severity, and sometimes to get to severity, you have to be swift. How have all of you been able to deal with that problem so that you can get the quickness? Because what we have found, sometimes, you know, when we're going after a long-term investigation, a whole lot more violence happens while we're building that case to get to it, and it seems to be counterproductive. So,
Can I make this, maybe Lauren, could just to start with, that you have an innovative practice with people who get arrested with a gun in Philadelphia. How do you all hand that from the DA's perspective, like of swift and certain punishment?
Well, that's why you have to look at what your non-traditional levers are. So we still do longer-term investigations. I mean, we have our first one coming that everybody else here is talking about. I only specifically discuss what our non-traditional levers are to deal with that, right? So you don't have an arrest coming for 6 months, but you know, Maurice shot Chauncey. What are you going to do? So there has to be something in your jurisdiction. Do you have a partnership with your courts? You know, do you have a partnership, and you're shaking your head now. So, I mean, there's child support enforcement. Do you have the Forfeiture Act? Do you have other levers? Exactly, sorry. But, I mean, we even go after people who are scofflaw, people who have traffic tickets. They get pulled in. So every possible legal lever that we have, we look across the board, and all we do is we put them on the top of that list. But that has to happen immediately. And the longer-term investigations you're talking about are still occurring in the background. So, you know, you have a shooting, and then you don't, sometimes an arrest doesn't, homicide isn't solved within 3 weeks, but you know who did it the next day. So that's, we're trying to do both at the same time.
Can I just, I'd like to jump in on that too and say, some of it has to do with your relationship with the prosecutor and the courts, and some of it doesn't. We've done everything from work with parole and probation to get conditions of probation and parole changed in the way that they can do it before they need to go back to court. So if your curfew was at 10 o'clock, maybe it's at 7. If it was at midnight, maybe it's at 9 o'clock. Maybe you can't go out on weekends. If you were meeting at a kiosk, which you can do in New York instead of seeing a probation officer, maybe now you have to see the probation officer in person. If you were seeing them every 2 weeks, maybe now it's once a week. Parole has started meeting with parolees who are in a group where we're doing an enforcement action in precinct station houses. That's inconvenient. That's not quite as bad as turning off the electricity, but having a parolee go into a police precinct station house regularly, that's changing their life a little bit. We also have looked at people who have a whole lot of parking tickets and brought the sheriff in, because the sheriff can go to court and get a property seizure order. They don't even have to use it. They can just go to someone's home and say, I have this. You're in a group. I have this because your group committed a homicide, or your group is the most violent group at the time, so that they know that this promise is real. There are lots of things that you can do, even when you have absolutely no other lever to pull. There's nothing on somebody. They don't drive with a suspended license. They're not stealing power. They're, you can't find anything, but you want to do something in the short term. That means you do what we're doing, and you go to their door with the ATF, you go to their door with the precinct commanding officer and a minister, and you deliver the entire ceasefire message to them, to their family member, and you say, we're here not just because it's an abstract idea, we're here because your group that you're in committed a homicide, and we're watching you. That's powerful, and it's powerful to have the mom there while that's happening. I don't think you can overestimate how important these seemingly small actions are in serving as wake-up calls and changing people's behavior and getting the group dynamic that's so negative to turn positive. And that's important. So while the homicide investigation goes on, while you're building the conspiracy case, there should be little consequences that let people know you know who they are, you know what happened, and life changes.
Just piggyback on Susan briefly. One of the things we do in New Orleans, obviously we do custom custom notifications. But obviously, these investigations take a month, a year, 18 months. And one of the other things that we do is we go back and look at criminal history and see if there was a refused weapons charge, a refused drug charge. Obviously, to see if it's a viable case, it's worthy of prosecution, and if we can institute that case again, or reinstitute it, and hold the target down because his name is surfacing now in 3 shootings in the last 2 weeks, we traditionally do that. Additionally, if we have no other levers, I like a what I'll call a rather informal custom notification. As long as you're not on any Title IIIs or there's any type of surveillance, you find them and you tell them, we are going to indict you, and we are going to indict you for racketeering, and you're going to be sitting at the same table with a handful of your little partners who have 5 bodies on them, and it's coming. And it ties into what David talked about, that the consequences have to exist. And they have to know, they have to be certain. And I've done that probably about 4 or 5 times. And every time when we bring in the defendant to debrief, they just shake their head and they said, man, you told us this was going to happen. And I know Maurice and I actually had a common defendant in that sense, but you tell them, and when they believe it, it gets out on the street. Man, you know, they call the gang unit, there's them people and then them people. And we're them people. And they get it out there that they're coming. And I think that does have some a strong effect on deterrence as well.
Other questions? Well, I have a question for, if I could ask, I mean, for the panel, but for you, Susan, just with your experience working with crime victims, is so it's been a long time since I've been a real prosecutor, so I say this from a distance, but I always was under the impression, I sort of thought when you do one of these cases, there's this sort of no snitching, sort of that the people don't cooperate and they're sort of not cooperating with law enforcement, and it's sort of it's almost like they're against law enforcement. Then I was robbed on the subway and reported to the police, but there was a big part of me which was, I kind of almost want to let this go because I've got kids, I just don't really, I'm actually not cooperating because I don't like the police, because I actually work with the police. I'm actually not cooperating because I'm scared to death. And then I started to imagine what it must be like if you live in Lincoln houses or you live anywhere, and how this dynamic, because it seems like for all the cases you guys build, so much of it is building the trust with the community who are going to be your witnesses, whatever they saw, is what's your perspective, and then also the panelists, what's your perspective in I know that a part of it is that people can be tried and true gang members and they don't, they spit at law enforcement if they don't want it, but for an awful lot of other people, making that decision and what are the factors that go into whether somebody is willing to step forward and testify?
It's exactly as you said. I don't need to add at all to it. The no snitching culture thrives on fear. That's the #1 reason why prosecutions fail, is intimidated witnesses. I don't have to tell all of you that. So to the extent that you can help victims and relocate them, or provide some assurance that this person is going to be away, or it's helpful. But this only underscores how important it is to do those little things that change behavior and stop the violence. Because I don't need a witness, I don't need a victim to change somebody's parole or probation conditions. I don't need a victim, I don't need a witness to seize somebody's car when they're driving with a suspended license. Same with seizing property for parking tickets. Same with turning off their utilities. These creative methods are working to stop violence. So that's really our goal, isn't it? Our goal is to stop the violence. It's not to put people away for the longest period that we can put them away for. It's to stop the violence. And if this helps us save lives, let's do some of these little things. Chauncey, your question, is it true, or is it, what do we do to help victims become safer? I think we've got whole communities that feel unprotected. And the best thing we can do is stop the violence in their community. That's the best thing that we can do.
Anything? Yeah, it's the biggest problem that we have, and it's the hardest thing to work through. And this is one of the things that I think works out well with these federal or state grand jury investigations, that you start bringing everybody from the community in that neighborhood to testify as to what they know. You may start off with, look, everybody's got a neighborhood with a little old lady who sits on our front porch who knows everything that happens in the neighborhood, who broke whose window, you know, who the gang members are, who shot. She just knows everything. You can find that person to bring that lady in to the grand jury. Now, the grand jury is done secretly. You may have a lot of good, you know, lay witnesses who are obviously law-abiding people who from the neighborhood will come in and will testify before the grand jury. They're not really interested, though, in a year from that point, after the indictments come down, to get on the stand and testify. And so with sometimes that we have some of the things we did, and that's one of the reasons why cooperation is so hugely important in these gang cases. I might be able to indict the gang based on the testimony of, let's say, witnesses 1, 2, and 3. Now I indict the gang, 10 gang members, and I can take the younger gang members, and those guys come in and flip. They can give me the same testimony as the lay witnesses would give me. I can use those guys on the stand and protect those quote-unquote truly innocent witnesses. Nobody ever knows they were involved. There's ways to do that if you do it, you know, correctly. But obviously the protection of witnesses and getting the community's trust, it takes a lot. It takes a lot of time sitting down talking with people, understanding their problems and in the community.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Tate. I'll do one other thing. Also to these grand jury investigations, as you bring people in from the community and you learn so much about what's going on in the community, you also sometimes as a prosecutor realize that maybe you're going up the wrong tree. That the person or one of the guys that you have identified as a gang member may not be a gang member. Because some witnesses are telling you he's not part of or he's not selling the cocaine. And that's fine. But it's the collection of evidence that allows us then to make a good decision, and the time the indictment comes down, that person is cut out. We've exonerated several people from who our initial targets were. It's an investigative stage of the prosecution, and so we have to go through that information and get the truthful information so we can find out when the indictments do come down that they are based, in fact, on truth.
I was just going to say, we've solved the problem a different way. We have really stepped up our police community engagement. We do a lot of stuff, peace walks, hot dog cookouts, all kinds of stuff. We have something called Cookies with Cops, where we go into the schools and bake cookies with the children. We have seen two things: violence go down and cooperation go up. All of a sudden we're getting all kinds of cooperation from all kinds of people. Seems to be working.
One other thing I'd be brief on is that I've heard it numerous times too. The community wants to know that if they do cooperate, these guys aren't coming out. And, you know, they see it when they see it in the courtroom, when they see that these guys are going to trial and we're not cutting them, you know, a 15-year deal for a manslaughter, and that these guys are going away for long periods of time. It almost snowballs. In the sense of confidence in law enforcement grows, and it opens up the levels of cooperation. You know, and I've seen it more than I can think of right now over the last couple of years, where people say to you too, you know, you guys are for real, and you have to be able to instill that confidence in the community.
Other questions?
Yeah. One of the things that we found, one of the biggest pushbacks we got when we first started what we call Project Longevity, which is a version of CERT, which is focused deterrence, was that there's a basic distrust in the community for police. We all realize that, okay? And one of the things that we learned was we got pushback on how we identified gang members. We got a lot of pushback from the community, and I'm not talking about the gang member community. I'm talking about clergy, I'm talking about community leaders, I'm talking about politicians. Did we identify someone as a gang member because they wore their hat a certain way, or wore their pants back? Okay? So it was a very real issue. Okay, so we learned the first thing we had to do was educate the people that wanted to cooperate with police, that wanted to be part of what we were doing. So the first thing we did was, and one of my sergeants here, we did the research on it, and a lieutenant, was that we set up a criteria for naming a gang member. And we didn't have a really good criteria in Connecticut, so we stole a statute from Massachusetts, okay, on how gang members were identified by statute that had case law, that was proven to work, and we presented that to the community. And we got a lot of buy-in because of that, because they knew we weren't just saying that kid's walking down the street and his hat's on sideways and he's wearing baggy pants and maybe he has a red shirt on, so we're going to name him a gang member. So we had a specific criteria. We had something that we were able to show, demonstrate to the community that this is how we identify gang members and educate our community that way. And our community bought into that because they realized we just weren't doing something really new. And the other thing I heard out here, and that I heard someone, and I'm not calling anybody out, say, well, we don't really have retaliation killings. We have a killing because somebody dissed somebody's girl. Well, all that violence is group driven, okay? And that's what we're trying to affect, these groups. So even though it doesn't seem like it's a group conflict, just because somebody isn't fighting over drug territory doesn't mean that it's not a group-driven homicide or shooting, okay? And what we do is, on a call-in, which I'm sure most of us have done and know, is that we bring in these groups and we tell them what the rules are. So when we do the enforcement action that everybody else up there is talking about, we've given them the heads up beforehand. That's never happened before. And if our community groups realize that, okay, and we explain that to them, then we have community buy-in. You don't have that suspicion that we're just going after the downtrodden in our society. And that's what we try to do. You have to educate first. You have to educate your community. You have to educate the people you work with, including the law enforcement people. Okay? And once you do that, everybody gets on board and everybody's on the same page. And that's where we get to where you guys are. Where now we can pull those levers with the backing of the community. And that's what we try to do.
One of the things I did in one of the recent gang cases I did is, once I did the indictment, I brought all the defendants in one by one with their attorneys, and I do this for all the defendants, and I go through a PowerPoint presentation with them of the evidence the government is going to show at trial, just to show them that we're not bluffing. But obviously all the defendants, when the defendant gets arrested, what goes through his mind? You know, when he calls his mom from jail, what's he telling his mom? Yeah, Mom, I killed these 5 people, I was dealing drugs. No. He always tells his loved ones, I'm being railroaded, somebody's lying on me, right, the whole thing. So you have the families of the defendants who think wrongly that law enforcement has it wrong. And so what I did last time was I invited all of their moms to the U.S. Attorney's Office, one by one, with their defense counsel. And I went through the aunt, mom, grandmother, whoever it was. A couple of them had a dad or two that showed up. And I presented all the evidence to their families, one by one. I let them listen to the phone calls, the recorded telephone calls we had. I showed them the pictures of the dead individuals. I showed them the evidence that we had. And it was the first time I'd ever done it. And I'm telling you, it worked well. Because every one of those moms got up and looked at me and said, I appreciate you for telling me the truth about what my son was involved in. And one of them even apologized to me, saying, I can't believe my son has committed this kind of havoc in this community. So when they go back out to the house that night, the defendant's going to call Mom on the phone and say, Mom, I can't believe they got me in here. She's going to say, son, I heard the phone call. You need to get in there and do the right thing. Right? You need to show people, and the community has to have confidence in us that we are doing the right thing, that we have found out the facts of the case. Well, however hurtful those facts may be, that we are operating with the truth. And once any family member is confronted with that, I'm saying the overwhelming majority are going to understand that law enforcement is in fact doing the right thing, no matter how painful it may be at that point in time. And hopefully we can come to some resolution how to resolve that individual case.
So we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Panelists. I'm the Chief of Police in the Inquiry District of the Louisiana. My question, well, I have two questions actually. One is, we have a lot of issues with individuals that we prosecute that sits in jail, and then I'm pretty sure they have the same problem up here, where they then order people dead from in the jail.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with that type of situation? And then my other question is, I listened to this sermon.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about the marijuana piece of the what New York PD did to counter some of the marijuana problems that you had with the misdemeanor part of it. We actually just passed a bill back home where, similar to what he did, what New York did with the marijuana piece. And we're struggling now because we're having the same issues that I heard you talk about as far as the community believing now that marijuana is legal, but it's not. And what we did, the bill actually allows for anything under an ounce of marijuana to be a fine versus being arrested. And so now what we have is we have the community with the, I guess, the perception that now that the bill is passed, that marijuana is actually illegal when in fact it's not. So my question to you is, yeah, but you see, it goes a little bit beyond that. What happened is they passed the bill, but you have a summons. How do you work the summons piece for New York PD?
So you have to be eligible for a summons to get a summons, which means you don't have a warrant, you don't have an open case. If you meet the criteria, you have identification on you at the time. If you don't have identification, we may take you back to the precinct. You have time to get identification. You can call your mom and say, bring down my school card, whatever it is, you have some time. But if you have no identification, or you have a warrant, or you have an open case, you're not eligible for a summons. And at that point, even for that small amount, you're going to be arrested. If you get a summons, you go to a different part of our court system, and the summons part, and you pay a fine on the summons.
So this is primarily for what, minors?
No, it's for anybody, any age, anybody who has a small amount of marijuana on them. If you're smoking marijuana in public, you will be arrested for that. That's still a misdemeanor.
So let me just ask you on the last. So for the last part of your question, we have about a minute to give maybe Lauren, do you want to talk about what you do? The question of, and for the rest of the panel, if there's what you do for people threatening witnesses from in jail on these violent crime cases, what you do to protect your witnesses, or what do you do to control that?
So we stole Manhattan DA's office idea of interns that we have listening to prison calls. So obviously, I mean, how many people do you have incarcerated? You can't possibly listen to every call. But what we do have on some of our higher priority cases is that we have free help from colleges, and the students get college credit. And that's kind of how we're currently attempting anyway to kind of go through all of the calls that we're getting.
You got a problem getting cell phones in the jail?
Yes, we do.
If you can solve that problem, please let me know. We have the same problem. I think we did a search in one of our jails in Louisiana. The small local jail had over 35 cell phones in one search.
About as fast as we get them out, as fast as they come back.
It's until we can get a stop to that, I'm not sure how we're going to do it. I've asked some of the sheriffs to look into put cell blocking technology in the jail so that even if somebody does get it, it's just a brick. If someone's accomplished that, please let me know, because we haven't had much luck in getting that done. But it is a huge problem, and if people or witnesses start getting threats from jail, even when we got the guy locked up, if he's still able to reach out and touch, the witnesses aren't coming forward, the case is going to collapse, the defendant's going to get back on the street again, and somebody's going to get killed. It is a huge problem.
So please join me in thanking our panelists.